All right, here we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sydney, coming to you from here this weekend, the first weekend of winter. But as far as we're concerned here for our Chronological Bible Reading Plan, we are kicking into week number 18 of our readings. As I've mentioned probably a couple of weeks ago, here in our reading through the Bible through a year, we are spending 7 weeks around about with a focus on David. And so this week's readings, no surprise, we're well into the thick of that. We're looking essentially at 3 books and going back and forth from each of them. The book of Samuel, Chronicles and Psalms. Samuel kind of reads the story as it happens. It kind of has that feel to it, telling the good, the bad and the ugly of David's journey. The book of Chronicles is different. While it tells many of the same stories, it is a book that is written about 600 to 700 years after the fact. So it's very much a looking back book, focusing on the good things of David's story and his reign. As I explained last week, a lot of lists and genealogies in that as well. So similar stories, but very different feel to it. And then, of course, the book of Psalms, which many of the songs that we're reading in the book of Psalms are written either by David or his associates, all of them written in the Davidic era, although the exact chronology of them is a little bit hard to determine. But anyway, so that's what we're doing. We're in the thick of reading about David. This week, we're going to be reading 2 Samuel chapter 5 and then 1 Chronicles 11 through to 16. So only 7 chapters of narrative this week. And I want to ask you, please sit down and read those 7 chapters in one sitting. All right, if you can do that, that'd be great. The whole idea, remember, of this Chronological Bible Plan is helping us to see the big picture. So we're not giving attention too much to a lot of detail, just helping us highlight the big picture view. And as I've said before, sitting down in one sitting and reading the passages that we've been allocated is a really helpful thing for that. So as you read those 7 chapters this week, there are 3 things that I want to bring to your attention that help us see the big picture of the biblical narrative. 3 important things that take place. The first thing we're going to see is that David is anointed king over all of Israel now. Okay? Up to this point, he's only been recognized as king in his own tribe, the tribe of Judah. So Judah, if you look at a map, is essentially the southernmost tribe. Okay, so David's tribe of Judah has recognized him as king. This week, all the other tribes are now acknowledging him as king over all Israel. So essentially the northern tribes. Now, this distinction of Judah in the south and all the rest of Israel in the north is something that's important to note now, because it becomes very important after the death of King Solomon. This united kingdom that David has, okay, actually splits again, with Judah being separated from the rest of the northern tribes. So I just want to acknowledge it now, that distinction is sort of written into the narrative, because it will become very, very important later on as we get into the prophets in the era of what we call the divided kingdom. But right now, we have a united kingdom. All 13 tribes are backing David, and they show their support to him in a significant way by sending to him the best of their fighting men so that he can form one national army. So that's the important thing that happens this week. The second major thing that happens is that David chooses Jerusalem as his capital city. It's the capital city now of the kingdom of Israel. It's where he will build his palace, and it's where eventually the temple for worship will be built, which is really significant, because that is basically showing us the fulfillment of the prophecy Moses made right back in Deuteronomy chapter 12. Before God's people went to the promised land, he said, listen, in the promised land there will be a place where I will put my name. My name will dwell there. Do you remember reading that? I said to you, it's a little bit like the land of Eden in Genesis. And within the land of Eden, there is the Garden of Eden, where God's special presence dwelt. Okay, so that's in the promised land. There is a special place where I'm going to put my name. And that place becomes Jerusalem, certainly once the temple is built. So this is important for David, choosing Jerusalem as his home base, political capital, and eventually the religious capital of this united nation, or united kingdom now, of Israel. Which begs the question, Why did David choose Jerusalem to be his capital? What was it about Jerusalem that made David think, I want that place, I'm happy to base myself there, build my palace there, and make that the political capital of this kingdom? Because what's interesting this week is that the text itself doesn't actually tell us. You know, it's normal for David and for all the prophets and God's leaders so far, whenever they make a major decision, they get a word from a prophet, they consult the Urim and Thummim, okay, you know, that thing, or they have a word from God or an angel appear to them or whatever. But in this story, what's interesting to me is David makes this major decision, and there's no part of the story that makes it clear God spoke to him. So it opens it up to a bunch of speculation as to what could be the reasons that God, or that David at this point, chooses Jerusalem to be his home base. Well, there's different theories about that. There's practical reasons. One of the things we know about Jerusalem is that it has an endless water supply through natural springs, something called the Gihon Springs, okay, that is basically an endless natural water supply for the city of Jerusalem, which is very handy when you've got a city in the middle of the desert, okay? So that was obviously a very natural reason to choose Jerusalem. There are military reasons. Jerusalem as a city is built with ravines all around it, so it's built up high, so that's very natural protection, like a natural fortress for military reasons. In fact, Jerusalem, one of the names that David ends up giving it is Mount Zion. It's on a mountain, basically, okay, with surrounded by ravines and valleys, and so it's, for military purposes, it's very secure. Maybe he chose it for access reasons. When you look at the map of the Promised Land, Jerusalem is relatively central, north, south, east, and west, for all the other tribes to come together and to be united in that capital. Maybe he chose it for political reasons. One of the interesting things about Jerusalem is that it was on the border between Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, the land allocated to Benjamin, which was where Saul was from. David was from Judah, Saul was from Benjamin, and David chose the capital city to be right here on the border. So is that David's way of recognizing the kingship of Saul? That he's still saying, you know, we're in this together. I'm not choosing a city that's within my tribal area. I'm choosing a neutral place, a border town, okay? Because the other thing about Jerusalem at this stage is that there's no Hebrews lived there. Okay, while there'd been a couple of battles there in the past, we read about that in Joshua and Judges, while there'd been a couple of battles, the foreigners still lived there, or the Jebusites still lived there, okay? So it wasn't an established Hebrew town. So maybe David chose it because of its neutrality and its way that it recognized King Saul and his legacy. Maybe it was for political reasons. Ultimately, what we do find out later, okay, is that it was for God reasons. And we don't actually find this out, interestingly enough, until 2 Chronicles chapter 6, I think it is, when Solomon himself, when he starts to build the temple, says these words, something like this. He says, God spoke to my father David and told him this would be the place where he would put his name in fulfillment of the prophecy to Moses. So somewhere along the line, God speaks to David and said, that's where I want you to base yourself. What's interesting is that we don't actually read about that this week. We find that out later. Okay, anyway, the point is, David is anointed king over Israel, number one. Number two, he establishes Jerusalem as his capital city. And the third thing we're going to see this week is he finds the Ark of the Covenant and wants to bring that to him in Jerusalem, because hearing God's voice, okay, following God's commands is very important to David. He doesn't want to fall into the same trap that Saul did and not consult God on major issues, not have the voice of God close to him, the presence of God close to him. And so the Ark of the Covenant that Moses had in the tabernacle all those years before, the Ark that spoke about the holy, holy presence of God, David brings that back. He learns a lesson though. He has to bring it back in accordance with what Moses had written. So the worship style or the worship prescriptions of Moses was still very important to God at this stage in history. Okay, that's important to know. But as he brings back the Ark of the Covenant, he brings it back with celebration and joy and instruments and praise and worship, which is part of the Davidic worship of celebration with music that is very important to the rest of the biblical story. And so that brings us to the Psalms. 3 things I wanted to note in the narrative. King over all Israel. Jerusalem is now the capital of the kingdom. And David brings back the Ark of the Presence because God's presence is so important to him. Which, as I said, brings us to the Psalms. This week, it's not just 7 chapters of narrative you're reading. You're also going to be reading 20 Psalms. Again, many of these Psalms this week are written by David. Some of them are long. Some of them are really short. All right? Some of them are prophetic, speaking of things that come into the future. Some of them are historical recall. They tell the story of creation, the story of the journey through the desert again. So you've got to be reading Psalms like that. Some of them are going to be very familiar to you. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. We're going to be reading Psalm 23 this week, and others that you are really going to know. They're probably already highlighted in your Bible. Some of them are familiar because they're quoted in the New Testament. Some of them have lines that are sung in songs that the modern church sings today. So as you read these Psalms this week, you're going to notice that. Some of them you can, as I said, overlook the fact that they're not quite in chronological order. You're going to notice that this week. But I want you to not overlook one thing. I'm going to finish on this. This week, it's the first time I've noticed it. I don't know whether it's come across our path in the other Psalms. But this week, what stood out to me is a word in 1 or 2 of the Psalms this week, which is Selah. S-E-L-A-H. Selah or Selah. I want you to pay attention to that word. Selah is a Hebrew word found 71 times throughout the Psalms. The prophet Habakkuk uses it a couple of times as well, but essentially it's just in the book of Psalms. And it's essentially what we think is a musical term. Remember, the Psalms are songs, okay? So Selah is a musical term which literally means to stop and to ponder or to think about what it is you're reading, to think about what it is you are singing. In fact, one theory says that possibly Selah, as a musical term, is actually just a break in the singing where the instruments would take over. It's like the instrumental phase of the song, okay? So this is why I'm making a deal of this. We're only reading this week 7 chapters of narrative, and as you just promised me, you're going to do that in one sitting. But we're reading 20 Psalms, and so the narrative is going to be quite quick. I want you to spend your time this week in the Psalms, read them slowly, and read them with Selah moments, okay? There are some real gems in the Psalms that you're going to read this week. So read them devotionally. Read them worshipfully, okay? Read, reflect, and respond. And have moments, reading them slowly, where you can have a Selah time. You can read a passage and then stop and actually worship God with that passage, okay? We're not just getting information in our head. This week I want you to spend time with your heart engaging with heaven in worship, using those words on the page, because you're going to find some great words this week as you spend time in the Psalms. All right? Bless you guys. Have a great week. 7 chapters of narrative, 20 Psalms. You're going to enjoy it. I've got a conference to get to and then back on a plane, and I'll see you all at church tomorrow. Bless you heaps. 13-minute video. Okay, bye.